Tonight on Ukraine Today. Scandal at Bloomberg. Did Steve Witkoff really help the Russians push their interests in talks with Donald Trump? A presidential summit. How likely is it that Zelenskyy and Trump will meet on November 27th? The coalition of the willing. What did the latest online meeting of the allies achieve? And what do they say about the Russian-American peace plan? And China steps in. How Beijing is actively using Russia's weakness just to squeeze more from it. All that and more, right now. Hello, my name is Volodymyr Robchun and this is Ukraine Today. Please subscribe, hit like, and let's move to the news. We start with the battlefield situation, with Russian strikes and Ukraine's response, and then we go to some pretty interesting Bloomberg publications about the so-called Russian-American peace plan. A small spoiler, Witkoff, it seems, really helped the Russians push their interests in conversation with Trump. More details in a moment. Over the past day, Russia lost at least 980 soldiers killed and wounded. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, that's already 1,168,550 occupiers. Over the last 24 hours, Ukraine's defense forces destroyed 4 Russian tanks, 1 armored fighting vehicle, 44 artillery systems and dozens of other pieces of enemy equipment. The one can escape from the Russian army and survive. The story of Vladimir, the hero of our next report, proves it. A Russian who refused to kill and to be part of the empire of evil.
Vladimir Bernhard, an ordinary Russian man from the town of Abinsk in the Krasnodar region, was mobilized into the Russian army in September 2022. He was a patriot and a decent citizen, loyal to the Kremlin's policies and supportive of the so-called special military operation. But after finding himself in the hell of war, he radically changed his point of view.
There is no justice, and it turns out that our state, represented by our top leaders, does not create this justice. They don't want to pursue it and they don't want to instill it.
Vladimir served for more than 2 years in a medical evacuation company. He saved soldiers and provided them with first aid. 3 months after he began his service, his views became anti-war. In 2023, the man started a blog on Telegram and a YouTube channel called Cossack's Diary, where he reported directly from the front lines about local assaults and the attitude of the officers toward ordinary soldiers. For this, Vladimir was thrown into a pit, beaten and even threatened with being zeroed out. But the truth teller did not give up.
In December 2024, I did not return to the front after my leave and went on the run. I lived in the forest, tried to catch fish and game and gathered berries and mushrooms. In August 2025, I tried to illegally cross the border between Russia and Georgia, reaching it through the mountains on a motorcycle. I couldn't do it legally. First, I was put on the federal wanted list because of a criminal case for unauthorized absence from my unit. Second, I didn't have a valid Russian or international passport.
Vladimir was unable to cross the border into Georgia after 10 months of wandering and a failed attempt to leave Russia. He returned to his private house in Abinsk, where he began to devise a new plan to escape the country. He considered fleeing to Finland, Azerbaijan or Armenia. He even thought about just living in a hut in Siberia. But after some time, the neighbors reported Vladimir to the authorities. He was detained a few hundred meters from his house.
They put handcuffs on me, forced me face down to the ground and started beating me. They hit me with the butt of a rifle and kicked me with their boots. Fortunately, I used to practice universal combat and know how to turn away to soften the blows. My teeth and ribs remained intact. One of the officers beating me asked if I had any knives. Where are my documents and money? He asked about the money 2 or 3 times. I pointed out where everything was. Later it turned out that I was missing more than 80,000 rubles. Almost all the money I had planned to use to escape.
Vladimir was held in the military commandant's building in a cage along with 4 other detainees. We had to sleep on the floor, food was brought to us and we were taken to the bathroom under guard. After 3 weeks of hellish conditions, the man was taken for interrogation by FSB officers. They told him that a criminal case was being prepared against him for spreading fake news, for posts about what was really happening on the front line. The prospect of facing 2 criminal cases, a lenient sentence, and then being sent back to the front line. Vladimir once again started thinking about an escape plan. At that time, he and several dozen other escapees were sent to a military unit in the Krasnodar region, where they were kept under military guard. During this time, Vladimir established a reputation as a deserter who had come to his senses. He was issued a new Russian Federation passport.
I woke up at 4 a.m., went to the bathroom, and saw that the entire shift of guards was asleep. I walked past them, jumped over the fence, made my way through the bushes, got into the city and called a taxi. And I went to the place where my motorcycle and the things that had been prepared for me in advance were waiting. Then I took off on my motorcycle toward the border with Belarus.
The man had to evade the traffic police several times, crashed his motorcycle, and had to throw away part of his gear. After that, he continued his journey by hitchhiking, using BlaBlaCar, and taking taxis. After 2 weeks on the run, he made it to Smolensk, from where he set out on foot toward the Belarusian border.
I'm walking along a wild boar trail. It's much easier for me to walk along here than to try and navigate over there. Everything is completely overgrown all the way up to the mushroom glade, which is 560 meters away from this point.
He managed to cross the border without encountering any border guards. In Belarus, Vladimir exchanged money, got a room, and cleaned himself up. After that, he bought a ticket and flew to another country. Now, after everything he has been through, Vladimir understands that a new difficult life in exile awaits him. And this is something he will never forgive the Kremlin for.
Most likely, I will never return to my homeland, even though I always wanted to live only in Russia. At the very least, I will dedicate part of my life to fighting the Putin regime within the means available to me. I will never forgive him for destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and forcing me to part with my loved ones and my homeland. In almost a year of my desertion, counting from last December when I didn't return to the war after my leave, I have never once doubted my decision. Under no circumstances am I ever willing to return to the front. At war, I became a pacifist, and I am not willing to betray my values and principles.
Russian forces attacked Zaporizhzhia. 19 people were injured. More than 30 apartment buildings were damaged, plus 20 private houses, a dormitory, a store and a gas station. Russian terrorists also hit energy infrastructure in Donetsk and Kharkiv regions. Emergency blackouts were introduced in Kharkiv, Sumy and Poltava regions. Ukrainian drones visited Cheboksary. They targeted the strategic research tech enterprise Vnir Progress. It develops and supplies electronics, hardware, software systems, and automation for the Russian army. So yes, this is a totally legitimate target. A meeting between the presidents of Ukraine and the United States may happen on November 27th. Axios reports this. According to the publication, Zelensky's main goal is to show Trump that Ukraine is ready for peace. Ukraine and the US officials had several meetings in Geneva and agreed on most elements of the peace plan proposed by Washington. There are parts of that Zelensky wants to discuss with the US president personally. Here's where the peace process stands right now.
No restrictions for the armed forces of Ukraine, no ban on joining NATO, and much more. The so-called Trump plan in its original form no longer exists. According to the Financial Times, it has been cut by almost a third, but the details have not yet been disclosed.
As of now, after Geneva, there are fewer points, no longer 28, and many important things have been taken into account in this framework. There is still work for all of us to do together. It's very difficult to create a final document, and everything needs to be done properly. And we appreciate that most of the world is ready to help us, and the American side is taking a constructive approach.
Sources informed about the course of the negotiations report the parties agreed to continue discussing only issues related to bilateral relations between Ukraine and the United States. Separate topics should be addressed in other formats. After all, the initial draft of the document included nuances that did not depend on Ukraine at all. Now, by presenting a united front, Europe and Ukraine have decided to discuss their respective issues with the United States while taking each other's interests into account.
This partnership not only allows them to act together, but also shows that their shared interests essentially create a strong foundation for joint action.
At the same time, to prevent leaks after the meeting, no copies of the new peace agreement were handed out, reported Ukraine's first deputy foreign minister Serhiy Kislitsia. All copies of the document agreed upon in Geneva were collected from everyone except the heads of the delegations. Nevertheless, some details still managed to leak to the press at the level of rumors. For example, there was a clear refusal to reduce the number of Ukrainian armed forces at Moscow's behest.
Our European partners have made it absolutely and unequivocally clear that Ukraine's sovereignty is not up for discussion at all, under any circumstances. Additionally, any restrictions or limitations on the military or on Ukraine's ability to join any alliance of its choosing are also not subject to negotiation. And from this point of view, it's clear that demands such as, for example, amending the constitution of Ukraine to prohibit joining NATO will be dropped. And I think these are the main important points.
Another crucial point for Ukraine was the discussion of security guarantees. According to analysts, the representatives from Washington managed to convey that such commitments from Russia mean absolutely nothing. Therefore, the only real guarantees can be agreements with the US and Europe, as well as the unhindered development of the defense industry within Ukraine itself. And here for the first time, it was stated that these are guarantees not only for Ukraine, but for the entire continent.
It's important to note that in Europe, there is now discussion about guaranteeing peace through strength. In other words, European countries are now officially and openly stating that we must be prepared to fight against Russia, including potentially on Ukrainian territory, if after the signing of a peace agreement, Russia violates those agreements. This moment, in my opinion, truly marks a significant tectonic shift, because previously such things were never openly discussed at all.
At the same time, the White House believes that the negotiations to end the war in Ukraine were productive, but a few disagreements remain, said White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre following the meeting. She also said in an interview with Fox News that arms supplies to Ukraine have their limits and cannot be endless, subtly hinting at what might happen to US aid if Kyiv pushes its position too aggressively. However, even when it comes to weapons, things are far from straightforward.
It is Europe that is buying American weapons for Ukraine. They are actually buying them. And from this perspective, Trump's threats, which have been voiced not to supply weapons to Ukraine, would in fact be a violation of agreements not only with Ukraine, but also with Europe.
And losing billion-dollar contracts and having to pay penalties for breaking them is clearly not what Donald Trump is counting on. Meanwhile, the American delegation is already in Abu Dhabi, where several days of meetings will be held with the Russian side. Russia will be presented with a peace plan that was agreed upon on Sunday between the US and Ukraine. According to experts, given that Moscow has previously stated that they haven't seen anything and need to look into the matter, this time the Kremlin also doesn't seem particularly inclined toward constructive dialogue.
But this gives the Russian Federation the opportunity to build a system in which they won't even, so to speak, engage with or consider this plan. In this way, they are trying to keep the initiative on their side and avoid getting drawn into this negotiation process. Because getting involved would essentially mean playing by someone else's rules, by the rules of Kyiv, Europe, Washington. Moscow, again, does not want to be in a position where it is being led and is perceived primarily by the United States as the main obstacle to achieving peace.
However, as analysts say, no one really expects that Putin will agree to terms acceptable to Europe without pressure. And this pressure should primarily come from Washington. This means that the main task is to convince the United States that the peace plan should be exactly this way.
Judging by the fact that the negotiations did not drag on and ended with a friendly dinner, these are clear signals and signs that everything went more than positively, more than well. But we also know the rather complicated character of Steve Witkoff, a man who is both extremely wealthy and extremely capricious, equally so. He would never have agreed, even just for the sake of politeness, to simply have dinner and spend his time if he felt that the results of these negotiations did not satisfy him.
Meanwhile, to ensure that Trump himself would not deviate from the course of peaceful settlement agreed upon at the meeting, the closest friends of the American leader in European politics flew to Washington, President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, and Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, who have already demonstrated more than once that they know how to find an approach to Donald Trump.
There is still no confirmation of Zelensky's visit to the US, but another trip is confirmed. Steve Witkoff to Moscow. According to Trump, his special representative will be there next week. And that brings us to the very interesting Bloomberg publications. The agency released a full transcript of a call between Witkoff and Ushakov, Putin's aide. Witkoff suggested that Moscow should move faster than Ukraine on Tomahawk supplies and talk to Trump in the right tone to secure their positions. The call happened on October 14th. Putin and Trump spoke on October 16th. The next day, on October 17th, when President Zelenskyy met Trump at the White House, he was denied the sale of American missiles. Based on this information, Witkoff acted, or maybe still acts, as a lobbyist for Kremlin interests. So the question is simple. Whose side is he on? The United States or Russia? And that's not all. Bloomberg also published a transcript of Ushakov's other call with negotiator Dmitriev about the so-called peace plan. According to the publication, on October 29th, they planned an informal handover of a document to the US side, a document that later was presented as an American peace plan. If that's true, then it becomes clear why the original US proposal looked like a push for Ukraine to surrender. And I just dare to assume that Witkoff was giving advice there as well, helping Kremlin agents convince Trump that this document deserves his attention. Meanwhile, an online meeting of the Coalition of the Willing took place, Sky News reports. It was led by the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron. The members discussed the latest progress on the peace plan.
Thank you all for moving forward together and staying coordinated and united. Friends, now we have a good result from Geneva and from the meetings and talks that took place there. Ukraine has the framework developed by our teams in Geneva. That framework is on the table, and we are ready to move forward together with the United States of America, with personal engagement of President Trump, and with Europe, with leaders, and with all partners who have their strengths and capacity to help. And I'm ready to meet with President Trump, and there are sensitive points to discuss. We have them still, and we think that the presence of European leaders could be helpful.
Earlier, Keir Starmer spoke in the British Parliament, summing up international efforts to stop Russia's war.
I can reassure the House that work is ongoing to refine this plan. And Mr. Speaker, we're clear about the fundamental principles here, that Ukraine's sovereignty must be maintained, that Ukraine should be able to defend herself in future, and that matters about Ukraine and its future must be determined by Ukraine. We are clear their voice must always be at the heart of the process, and elements relating to Europe and NATO will need the consent of Europe and NATO members. So there's still a long way to go and a tough road ahead, but we're more committed than ever to this cause and to pushing forward on this process.
Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. Now is a good moment to subscribe to the channel, like this video and share it. Please do it. Thank you, and glory to Ukraine. There will be no peace while Putin believes he controls the situation, US Senator Lindsey Graham wrote. According to him, the Russian dictator will push for surrender, not peace. If he gets what he wants, global aggression will only grow. But Graham added, the United States and the rest of the world still have many strong cards to play against Putin's Russia. And it seems that China is actively using its influence on Putin simply to strip Russia for parts. Here's a clear example. Chinese exporters are raising prices for Russian buyers of military-industrial goods. More details ahead.
China is betraying Russia. Yes, you heard that right. Beijing masterfully pretends to be a partner, but in reality, it uses Moscow as the weak link.
And in our language, there's a phrase that has become a saying: Russians and Chinese are brothers forever.
But here's what's interesting. Recently, Xi spoke on the phone with Trump and stated that he supports the United States' peaceful efforts to resolve the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. It sounds nice in words, but what about in practice?
I think that China has sent a political signal to the United States indicating that it is closely monitoring what is happening in terms of peaceful regulation and the search for peaceful solutions in the Russian-Ukrainian war. The main point of this signal should be as follows: Russia must not win this war, and accordingly Ukraine must not lose. But
here's something else. The leaders of the countries have agreed on visits, and Trump is planning to go to China as early as April.
whether Trump will be able to reach the desired agreement with China, a trade agreement specifically in April, for example, during a potential meeting in Beijing, is a big question. Nothing deeper than that as far as I'm concerned, especially regarding the end of the Russia-Ukraine war. As for these dates, April 2026, a meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump in Beijing, there's nothing more to it.
But what is China doing wrong in relation to Russia? Everything seems to be going well. The thing is, China is making a lot of money off Russia. The prices of export goods supplied to Russia have increased by an average of 87%.
Relations between Russia and China have always been very complicated. And if we think they're friends, no, there's actually a good word for this. They're fellow travelers. Russia and China are fellow travelers. A weak Russia is beneficial to China. A weak Putin is beneficial to China. It's advantageous for China to buy raw materials cheaply and then sell goods to the Russian Federation at very high prices. Russia really has no other way out for the most part.
And it's not just about goods. China is gradually moving into Russian regions, thereby gaining access to territories and resources.
You know, there are already examples in the Far East where small settlements have become predominantly Chinese, and now they even participate in municipal elections there.
Russia, in turn, is becoming increasingly dependent on China.
And does Putin find such a relationship acceptable? Again, of course not, of course he doesn't. Well, because Putin has phantom pains about the Soviet Union. Basically, throughout his presidency, he has tried to restore some kind of former greatness. He calls himself the gatherer of Russian lands. But in reality, he is simply leading the Russian Federation to ruin. To complete absolute ruin, to financial bankruptcy?
Beijing is increasingly strengthening its influence in Central Asia, while pushing Moscow into the background, which is likely a cause for concern for the Kremlin's old man. It is necessary
to steadfastly strengthen the friendship between China and Kazakhstan, to join efforts in promoting all kinds of cooperation, and to make a greater contribution to peace in the region and the world, as well as to the development of stability and positive energy in China-Kazakhstan relations. So, the main question is, what exactly drives China? A reliable partnership with Russia.
Our close and ongoing communication clearly reflects the strategic nature of Russian-Chinese relations, which are now at an unprecedentedly high and mutually beneficial level.
Or is Beijing simply taking advantage of the situation and acting in its own interests?
They are not interested in the Russian Federation winning this war. Because if Putin wins this war, he restores his geopolitical agency. He starts talking to all the players, for example, with the United States and China on an equal footing, which is absolutely not in line with China's strategic interests. Yes, this position is covert.
China talks about friendship, but only acts when it benefits them. It profits from Russia, strengthens its own influence, and at the same time builds relations with the US. And Moscow is becoming increasingly dependent on Beijing's decisions.
That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you for your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share. See you next time.